This week's People of God, we're taking a look at the biblical story of Elijah, be found in 1 Kings chapter 16, 17, and 18. We see Elijah first enter the scene when the Lord instructed him to confront the evil king Ahab and Queen Jezebel. Jezebel worshiped Baal, hated God, wanted all of God's prophets dead. She was bad, he was bad. In fact, the end of chapter 16 tells us that Ahab did more to arouse the anger of the Lord than any other king before him. The Jewish people at that time were farmers, cultivators of the land. This is how they were nourished, but they didn't have any type of irrigation system. So the yield of their crop was completely dependent upon the Lord sending the two different rains, the early rain that came in October or November, and the latter rain that came in March or April. If that didn't happen, drought would occur. This story has drought all through it. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 11, if we back up about 600 years prior to this moment, we see that the blessing of rain actually depended upon the people's obedience to covenant. So the people were dependent upon the crop was dependent upon the rain was dependent upon the Lord, and the Lord's willingness to send the rain was dependent upon the people's obedience to the covenant he has set. So let me read in verse 13, Deuteronomy 11. God says, "So if you faithfully obey the commands I'm giving you today to love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, then I will send rain on your land and in its season, both autumn and spring rains, so that you may gather in your grain. New wine and olive oil, I will provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and you will eat and you will be satisfied. Be careful, or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods and to bow down to them." Verse 17, "Then the Lord's anger will burn against you." He gives them a warning all the way back 600 years earlier. "And he will shut up the heavens so that it will not rain, and the ground will yield no produce, and you will soon perish from the good land that the Lord has given you." The people, of course, 600 years later, in Elijah's time, did not obey. They actually gave themselves over to the worship of Baal and to all the grotesque practices thereof. So Elijah comes on the scene, not to warn, but to judge. The king had led the people away from the Lord, and therefore judgment was coming. The drought came as predicted, as Elijah predicted, so the king went out and searched for Elijah, I assume either to kill him or to ask for his help to bring rain back. But Elijah couldn't be found anywhere. In fact, the Lord had sent him out of Israel for the time being. 3 years later, though, Elijah reappears in Israel, and we find him back in the story. You'd probably know this story. He challenges 400 prophets of Baal, basically to like a spiritual duel of miracles. He ends up winning. He kills all the prophets. In essence, he cleanses the nation of sin. And then the rains come. God sends the rains again. So we have 3 years of drought until God sends the rain. So we have two big moments for Elijah. First of all, resistance, and then second of all, revival. But like I said, these two moments were 3 years apart. There was a lot that happened in that time. During the drought, the Lord gave Elijah 3 instructions in 3 years. So basically 1 instruction per year. The first one, go hide yourself. The next one, maybe up to a year later, leave Israel and go find this widow who lives in the town of Zarephath, who's outside of the nation of Israel. And after that, a couple years later, go back to Israel and present yourself to King Ahab. Honestly, this seems to me like a long time to have to wait on the Lord and hear God's instructions. 3 years and 3 instructions from the Lord, 3 words from the Lord. It just seems like a long time. But I think this can help us think through a couple major questions in our spiritual walk with the Lord. So first of all, what do you do when God hasn't spoken yet? You are waiting to hear a word from the Lord, and you're waiting and waiting and waiting, and maybe you're not good at waiting. I'm certainly not good at waiting, and he just hasn't spoken yet. The Lord didn't give Elijah a roadmap either. For the next 3 years, he was kind of on his own. He was in this waiting game. I imagine a roadmap would have provided a lot of comfort for Elijah, but I wonder if that's at times maybe what you and I expect from God is a roadmap for our life, a roadmap for our spiritual walk with him. So what happened in the meantime, though, is that the Lord actually provided for Elijah in some pretty miraculous ways, too. When God sent Elijah to hide at the brook, he also sent ravens to feed him every single day. He had water from the brook, he had food from the ravens, and he was content with that. The very food he ate every day was completely dependent upon God. When he made it to Zarephath, the widow of Zarephath needed food, and the Lord provided food to fill up her empty vessels day after day. When the widow's son died later on and they needed a resurrection, the Lord provided the power through Elijah to raise this little boy from the dead. But here's the deal. All of this took place one word at a time. There was no 5-year plan. There was no roadmap. It was just the word of God. So what do we do when God hasn't spoken yet? Well, what we can take away from Elijah's life is that he waited patiently on the Lord. When God said, stay at the brook, he stayed. When God said, move to Zarephath, he moved. Elijah fully understood that his success was completely dependent upon the Lord and upon his own ability to trust him fully. So that's the first question. The second question I have for you today is, are you content with the small things? In those days, the prophets were the mouthpiece of God. The way God spoke to the people was actually through a person. And so they didn't have this beautiful Bible bound up in leather, and it was the Word of God giving us instruction for life. They had prophets, and Elijah was the prophet at that time. And he was the only voice for God in Israel. And yet in this story, Elijah leaves the land and in essence creates a second drought, an absence of the Word of God. So we have an absence of rain, we have the absence of the Word of God. But this was also an absence of public ministry for Elijah in the beginning of private ministry. Theologian Warren Wiersbe says, Elijah hadn't been in public ministry for a long time, yet his private ministry to the woman and her son was just as important, both to the Lord and to them. The servant who won't hide himself and minister to a few people isn't really ready to stand on Mount Carmel and call down fire and rain from heaven. In fact, Jesus echoes this truth in the Gospels in Luke chapter 16, verse 10. He says, one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in very much, and the one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. Elijah found himself called to probably a much smaller platform than he had initially thought, and yet he proved himself faithful to the widow and to her son, and of course to the Lord. One of the things our society, I think, struggles with is contentment. We are barraged on every side with images of perfect people, perfect lives, big platforms, and even spiritually speaking, big ministries. And we watch these things happen and we want that. We have maybe a hard time being content with where the Lord has us. A good question for us today then is, will you be content in whatever the Lord chooses to give you right now? Elijah was, and I can name at least 2 people in the town of Zarephath whose lives were changed because of it as well. So I hope this gives you some things to discuss about today. Be open and honest with each other, and I look forward to seeing you this Sunday.